However, great events were unfolding around us in Italy. Masséna had received some reinforcements, restored a bit of order in his army, and the famous campaign of 1800, which led to the memorable siege of Genoa and the Battle of Marengo, was about to begin. The snow that had covered the mountains separating the two armies having melted, the Austrians attacked us, and their initial efforts focused on the 3rd Division of the right wing, which they sought to separate from the center and the left by pushing it from Savona toward Genoa. As soon as hostilities resumed, my father and Colonel Saclo sent all non-combatants to Genoa. Colindo was among them. As for me, I was filled with joy, excited by the sight of marching troops, the noisy movements of the artillery, and the eager desire that every young soldier feels to witness military operations. I had no idea that this war would become so terrible and cost me so dearly. My father's division, heavily attacked by vastly superior forces, defended for 2 days the famous positions of Cadibona and Montenotte, but finally, seeing itself on the verge of being outflanked, it had to retreat to Voltri and then to Genoa, where it joined the other 2 divisions of the right wing. I heard all the seasoned generals lamenting the necessity that forced us to separate from the center and the left wing, but I was then so unfamiliar with warfare that I was not affected at all. I understood well enough that we had been defeated, but having personally captured, in front of Montenotte, a Barco Hussar officer and taken his plume, which I had proudly fastened to my horse's bridle headstall, it seemed to me that this trophy gave me some resemblance to medieval knights returning laden with spoils from battles against infidels. My childish vanity was soon brought down by a dreadful event. During the retreat, and just as my father was giving me an order to deliver, he was struck by a bullet in the left leg, the same that had already been wounded by a bullet in the army of the Pyrenees. The shock was so great that my father would have fallen from his horse had he not leaned on me. I led him away from the battlefield. He was bandaged. I saw his blood flowing, and I began to cry. He tried to calm me and said that a warrior must show more fortitude. My father was transported to Genoa, to the Centurione Palace, which he had occupied during the previous winter. Our 3 divisions having entered Genoa, the Austrians blockaded the city by land and the English by sea. I do not have the strength to describe what the garrison and the population of Genoa suffered during the 2 months of this memorable siege. Famine, war, and a terrible typhus wreaked immense havoc. The garrison lost 10,000 men out of 16,000, and every day 700 to 800 corpses of inhabitants of all ages, genders, and conditions were collected in the streets and carried behind the church of Carignan into a huge pit filled with quicklime. The number of these victims rose to over 30,000, almost all of them dead from hunger. To understand the extent of the food shortage felt among the inhabitants, it must be known that the former Genoese government, in order to control the city's population, had for time immemorial seized the monopoly of grain, flour, and bread, which was produced in a vast facility armed with cannons and guarded by troops. Thus, when the Doge or the Senate wished to prevent or punish a revolt, they closed the state bakeries and starved the people into submission. Although the Genoese constitution had undergone major reforms by the time we were there, and the aristocracy had little remaining influence, there was not a single private bakery, and the tradition of baking bread in public ovens had persisted. These public ovens, which normally supplied a population of more than 120,000 souls, remained closed for 45 out of the 60 days of the siege. The rich had no better access to bread than the poor. The few dried vegetables and rice available from merchants had been bought at exorbitant prices at the beginning of the siege. The troops alone received a meager ration of 1/4 pound of horse meat and 1/4 pound of what was called bread, a dreadful mix made of spoiled flour, bran, starch, powdered hair pomade, oats, rancid linseed, walnuts, and other low-quality substances, held together with a bit of cocoa to give it some solidity, and internally reinforced with small wooden sticks without which it would crumble into powder. General Thibault, in his Journal of the Siege, compared this bread to peat mixed with oil. For 45 days, no bread or meat was sold to the public. The wealthiest inhabitants could, and only at the beginning of the siege, obtain a small amount of codfish, figs, other dried goods, and sugar. Oil, wine, and salt were never lacking. But what are these without solid food? All the dogs and cats in the city were eaten. A rat fetched a high price. Eventually, the misery became so unbearable that when the French troops made sorties, the inhabitants followed them in crowds outside the gates, and there, rich and poor, women, children, and old people began cutting grass, nettles, and leaves, which they later cooked with salt. The Genoese government had the grass growing on the ramparts mowed, then cooked it in public squares, and distributed it to the unfortunate sick who lacked the strength to collect and prepare this crude food themselves. Our troops also cooked nettles and all sorts of herbs with horse meat. The wealthiest and most distinguished families envied them this meat, disgusting as it was, because the shortage of fodder had made almost all horses sick, and even the meat of those that died from exhaustion was distributed. During the final phase of the siege, the Genoese people's exasperation was to be feared. One could hear them shouting that in 1746 their ancestors had massacred an Austrian army, that they should try the same against the French army, and that in the end it was better to die fighting than to die of hunger after watching their wives and children perish. These signs of revolt were all the more terrifying because, had they materialized, the English by sea and the Austrians by land would have surely joined forces with the insurgents to crush us. Amid such imminent dangers and calamities of every kind, General-in-Chief Masséna remained impassive and calm. To avoid any attempted uprising, he had a proclamation issued stating that French troops had orders to open fire on any gathering of more than 4 inhabitants. Our regiments constantly bivouacked on the squares and in the main streets, whose approaches were armed with cannons loaded with grapeshot. Unable to assemble, the Genoese could not revolt. You may wonder why General Masséna was so determined to hold a city he could not feed and could barely sustain the garrison. But Genoa at that moment weighed heavily on the fate of France. Our army was divided. The center and the left wing had retreated behind the Var, while Masséna had locked himself inside Genoa to tie down a part of the Austrian army, preventing it from concentrating all its forces in Provence. Masséna knew that the first consul was gathering a reserve army in Dijon, Lyon, and Geneva, with which he planned to cross the Alps via the St. Bernard Pass to return to Italy, surprise the Austrians, and fall on their rear while they were focused solely on capturing Genoa. We therefore had an immense interest in holding the city for as long as possible, as ordered by the first consul, whose foresight was confirmed by events. But let us return to what happened to me during this memorable siege. Upon learning that my wounded father had been taken to Genoa, Colindo Trepano rushed to his bedside, and there we met again. He affectionately helped me care for my father, and I was all the more grateful to him because, amid the calamities surrounding us, my father had no one else by his side. All the staff officers had been ordered to report to the General-in-Chief. Soon, our servants were denied rations and forced to take up arms and join the fighters to be entitled to the meager rations given to soldiers. Only a young valet named Houdin and a young jockey who cared for our horses were exempt, but Houdin abandoned us as soon as he learned that my father had contracted typhus. This dreadful disease, much like the plague, almost always strikes the wounded and those already ill. My father was stricken, and at the moment he needed care the most, he had only me, Colindo, and the jockey Bastide by his side. We did our best to follow the doctor's instructions, never sleeping day or night, constantly rubbing my father with camphorated oil and changing his bedding and linens. My father could only consume broth, and I had nothing to make it with but poor quality horse meat. My heart was torn. Providence sent us help. The large bakery buildings were adjacent to the walls of the palace we occupied. The terraces touched. The terrace of the public ovens was immense. It was where the mixing and grinding of all sorts of grains added to the spoiled flour for making the garrison's bread took place. Bastide had noticed that when the workers left the terrace, it was overrun with pigeons nesting in the city's bell towers, accustomed to gathering the scattered grains. Bastide, who was remarkably clever, crossed the small gap between the two terraces and set snares and other traps, catching pigeons, from which we made broth for my father, who found it excellent, compared to horse broth. To the horrors of famine and typhus were added those of relentless and savage war, for the French troops fought all day on land against the Austrians, and as soon as night fell and their attacks ceased, the English, Turkish, and Neapolitan fleets, hidden by darkness from the cannons of the port and coastal batteries, approached the city and launched an immense number of bombs, causing dreadful destruction. There was not a moment of rest. The sound of cannons, the cries of the dying, reached my father and deeply agitated him. He regretted being unable to lead his division's troops. This mental state worsened his condition. His illness grew more severe by the day. He visibly weakened. Colindo and I never left his side. Finally, one night, as I knelt beside his bed to dress his wound, he spoke to me with full clarity of mind. Then, sensing his end near, he placed his hand on my head, gently stroked it, and said, "Poor child, what will become of him, alone and without support, amid the horrors of this terrible siege?" He murmured a few more words, among which I distinguished my mother's name, then let his arms fall and closed his eyes. Although very young and only recently in service, I had seen many dead on various battlefields, and especially in the streets of Genoa, but they had fallen in the open, still clothed, which gives a very different impression from a man dying in his bed, and I had never witnessed that final and sorrowful sight. So, I thought my father had fallen asleep. Colindo realized the truth, but didn't have the courage to tell me, and I remained in error until several hours later when Mr. Lachaise arrived, and I saw him pull the sheet over my father's face, saying, "It is a terrible loss for his family and friends." Only then did I grasp the full extent of my misfortune. My grief was so heart-wrenching that even General-in-Chief Masséna, whose heart was not easily touched, especially under such circumstances requiring great fortitude, was moved. The critical situation he was in led him to take a measure regarding me that seemed atrocious at the time, though I would do the same myself if I were commanding in a besieged city. To avoid anything that might demoralize the troops, General Masséna had forbidden funeral pomp, and since he knew I had not wanted to leave my beloved father's remains, and feared I intended to accompany the bier to the grave, he worried that the troops might be moved at the sight of a young officer, barely out of childhood, sobbing as he followed the coffin of his father, a general of division and victim of the terrible war we were waging. Masséna came the next morning, before daylight, to the room where my father lay, and, taking me by the hand, led me under some pretense to a distant salon. Meanwhile, on his order, 12 grenadiers, accompanied only by an officer and Colonel Saclot, silently carried the bier away and laid it in a temporary grave on the ramparts facing the sea. It was only after this sombre ceremony was completed that General Masséna informed me of it and explained his reasons. No, I cannot express the despair this threw me into. It felt as though I lost my poor father a second time, taken from my final care. My complaints were in vain, and all I could do was go pray at my father's grave. I didn't know where it was, but my friend Colindo had followed the procession from a distance and led me there. That good young man showed me such touching sympathy in a moment when every person thought only of their own plight. Almost all the staff officers of my father had been killed or carried off by typhus. Out of 11 of us who were there before the campaign, only 2 remained, Commander Arbas and me. But only looked after himself, and, instead of supporting the son of his general, he continued to live alone in the city. Mr. Lachaise also abandoned me. Only the good Colonel Saclot showed me any interest. But the commander-in-chief had given him command of a brigade, so he was constantly outside the city walls, busy repelling the enemy. I was therefore left alone in the vast Centurione Palace, with Colindo, Bastide, and the old concierge. Barely a week had passed since I had the misfortune to lose my father, when the commander-in-chief Masséna, who needed a large number of officers around him, since he had some killed or wounded nearly every day, ordered me to serve as his aide-de-camp, just as Arceuk and all the officers of deceased or incapacitated generals were doing. I obeyed. I followed the commander-in-chief all day during battles, and when I was not held at headquarters, I returned, and when night fell, Colindo and I, passing among the dying and the corpses of men, women, and children that crowded the streets, went to pray at my father's tomb. The famine in the city was increasing in a frightening way. An order from the commander-in-chief prescribed that each officer was to keep only one horse. All others had to be sent to the slaughterhouse. My father had left several. It would have pained me greatly to know that these poor animals were going to be killed. I saved them by proposing to some staff officers to exchange their worn-out mounts for my father's horses, which I then handed over to the slaughterhouse. These horses were later paid for by the state upon presentation of the delivery order. I kept one of these orders as a curious relic. It bore the signature of General Oudinot, Chief of Staff to Masséna. The cruel loss I had just suffered, the position in which I found myself, and the truly horrible scenes I witnessed every day matured my reasoning in a short time more than several years of happiness would have done. I realized that the misery and calamities of the siege had made all those selfish, who, a few months before, had overwhelmed my father with attention. I had to find enough courage and resources within myself, not only to manage on my own, but also to support Colindo and Bastide. The most important thing was to find a way to feed them, since they did not receive rations from the army stores. As an officer, I did have 2 rations of horse meat and 2 rations of bread, but all that amounted to was 1 pound of very poor quality food, and we were 3. We caught pigeons only rarely, as their numbers had greatly decreased. In my role as aide-de-camp to the commander-in-chief, I had a place at his table, where once a day they served bread, roast horse meat, and chickpeas. But I was so bitter that General Masséna had deprived me of the sad consolation of accompanying my father's coffin that I could not bring myself to sit at his table, even though all my comrades did, and he had invited me once and for all. But, at last, the desire to help my 2 unfortunate companions decided me to eat at the commander-in-chief's table. From then on, Colindo and Bastide each received a 1/4 pound of bread and the same amount of horse meat. I myself did not eat enough, for the portions at the commander-in-chief's table were extremely small, and I performed very hard service. I felt my strength failing, and I was often forced to lie down on the ground to avoid fainting. Providence again came to our aid. Bastide was born in Cantal, and the previous winter he had met another Auvergnat he knew, who was established in Genoa, where he ran a small business. He went to see him, and was struck, upon entering, by the smell that filled a grocer's shop. He remarked on this to his friend, saying, "You have provisions." The friend admitted it and asked him to keep it secret, because any provisions of any kind discovered in private hands were confiscated and transported to the army's warehouses. The clever Bastide then offered to have someone buy the excess goods who would pay cash on the spot and keep an inviolable secret, and he came to inform me of his discovery. My father had left a few thousand francs. I bought and had delivered at night to my home a large amount of salt, cod, cheese, figs, sugar, chocolate, etc., etc. All of it was horribly expensive. The Auvergnat got almost all my money, but I considered myself too fortunate to submit to his terms, because, from what I heard daily at headquarters, the siege was expected to last a long time, and the famine to keep increasing, which unfortunately turned out to be true. What doubled my happiness at having procured these supplies was the thought that I was saving the life of my friend Colindo, who, without them, would have literally died of hunger, for he knew no one in the army except me and Colonel Saclot, who soon was struck by a terrible misfortune. Here is how: General Masséna, attacked from all sides, seeing his troops mowed down by continual combat and famine, forced to contain a huge population driven to despair by hunger, found himself in one of the most critical situations, and felt that to maintain order in the army, he had to enforce iron discipline. Thus, any officer who did not punctually execute his orders was mercilessly dismissed by virtue of the powers then granted to commanders-in-chief by law. Several examples of this kind had already been made when, during a sortie 6 leagues from the city, the brigade commanded by Colonel Saclot failed to be at the designated valley in time to block the Austrians, who then escaped. The commander-in-chief, furious that his plan had failed, dismissed poor Colonel Saclot and denounced him in a general order. Saclot may not have understood what was expected of him, but he was very brave. He took up a musket and placed himself in the ranks as a soldier. One day he came to see us. Colindo and I were heartbroken to see this excellent man dressed as a common foot soldier. We said our goodbyes to Saclot, who, after the city's surrender, was reinstated as colonel by the first consul at the request of Masséna himself, whom Saclot had forced, through his courage, to reconsider his judgment. But the following year, Saclot, seeing peace established in Europe and wanting to completely clear himself of the reproach so unjustly levelled against him, asked to go fight in Saint-Domingue, where he was killed just as he was about to be promoted to brigadier general. Some men, despite their merit, are fated to a cruel destiny. He is one such example. That concludes the 7th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.